gentlemen, I'm going to sign this bipartisan government funding bill. But with this bill, we're going to send a message to the American people, a strong message that Democrats and Republicans can actually come together and get something done, right, Nance? And to fulfill our most basic responsibilities.
President Joe Biden referring to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi as he signed into law a $1.5 trillion government funding bill, his first regular spending bill that contains his administration's priorities. It ends 5 months of temporary spending bills that have kept the government and public programs operating. Today's spending bill also including more than $13 billion to help Ukraine in its war for survival against Russia. Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, March 15th, 2022. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky telling the Canadian Parliament that he appreciates all that Canada and other countries have done so far, but he needs more weapons and a no-fly zone over his country to stop Russian aerial attacks. Zelensky is set to make the same plea Wednesday when he speaks to the U.S. Congress. White House announcing President Biden will be traveling to Europe next week for a NATO summit. Also today, warnings from the White House that COVID-19 programs in the U.S. could start shutting down if more money for them is not approved by Congress. On this Equal Pay Day, White House and Democrats in Congress calling for more reforms to make sure women and men are paid the same for the same work. Today's date symbolizing how far into the year women must work to earn what men earned in the previous year. Plus, we'll talk about President Biden's cryptocurrency executive order with an advisor to the blockchain business and a former government official. This from the Associated Press. Ukraine said Tuesday that Russia seemed to soften its stand in the talks aimed at halting the fighting, even as Moscow's forces stepped up their bombardment of Kyiv, smashing apartments, a subway station, and other civilian sites. Elsewhere around the country, civilians in at least 2,000 cars fled Mariupol along a humanitarian corridor in what was believed to be the biggest evacuation yet from the desperately besieged seaport, where bodies have had to be buried in mass graves. Also, the leaders of 3 European Union countries, including Poland, a NATO member, on Ukraine's doorstep, visited the embattled capital in a bold show of support amid the danger. That reporting from AP. In Washington, D.C., President Joe Biden, while signing the big U.S. government funding bill, highlighting money in that bill to help Ukraine.
This bill also includes historic funding, $13.6 billion, to address Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impact on surrounding countries. Putin's aggression against Ukraine has united people all across America, united our 2 parties in Congress, and united freedom-loving world. And it's an act with urgency and resolve that we're doing right now that you've provided me the ability to do. I want to thank the congressional leadership for working so quickly to make sure we have the resources we need, economic, humanitarian, and security, to continue our forceful response to this crisis. We've already committed more than $1.2 billion in security assistance to the people of Ukraine just over the past year. And I know all of you know that. It's preaching to the choir here. But we've been providing anti-armor, taking out tanks, anti-air capabilities directly to the Ukrainian forces. And we're also facilitating significant shipments of security assistance from our allied partners to Ukraine. With this new security funding and the drawdown authorities in this bill, we're moving urgently to further augment the support to the brave people of Ukraine as they defend their country. And I'll have much more to say about this tomorrow, about exactly what we're doing in Ukraine. We're also going to be better positioned to provide for the rapidly growing humanitarian needs of the Ukrainian people. This war has turned nearly 3 million Ukrainians into refugees, with numbers growing every single day. And that's on top of the 12 million people who require humanitarian assistance inside of Ukraine. The United States is helping to lead the global humanitarian response with our partners in Europe and well beyond Europe.
President Joe Biden in the Eisenhower Executive Office building signing the government funding bill that includes that money to help Ukraine. CNN writes that nearly 3 weeks into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration is still assessing the most effective way to get military aid into the country without triggering a wider war. While administration officials say the effort to provide Ukrainian forces with American-made weapons such as Javelin anti-tank and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles has been largely successful, the White House is under intense pressure to do more. Specifically, both Congress and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky have pressured Biden officials to help broker the transfer of heavier Soviet-made weaponry to Ukraine. The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell telling reporters on Capitol Hill today he would like to see more done.
With regard to the ongoing war in Ukraine, it seems to me the president believes that any effort to help the Ukrainians is potentially provocative to the Russians. Look, the provocation's already occurred. The war is underway. We need to do any and everything we can to help our Ukrainian friends, short of, as we all agree, putting American troops across the NATO line. All of the eastern NATO countries want to be helpful. We ought to be encouraging them to be helpful and not trying to deter their efforts to get arms of all kinds into the Ukrainians as rapidly as possible.
The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell at a news conference, part of the weaponry that some are advocating be sent to Ukraine, those MiG-29 fighter jets out of Poland and also S-300 surface-to-air missiles, both Soviet-era weapons. More from the minority leader as reporters asking him questions.
You talked about what is a bridge too far for the United States involving Ukraine. But how do you say no when Zelensky comes before the Congress virtually tomorrow and he's going to ask for specific things and going to come down hard, asking for no-fly zones? How do you say, we're going to help you, but?
Well, my guess is that everything he's going to request is something we ought to be doing. And so my individual response to that would be yes. Unfortunately, the administration keeps on dragging its heels. Even when they do the right thing, they do it too late. And the administration needs to get the message. We need to help the Ukrainians in every conceivable way, and we need to do it right now. Not only us, but our NATO allies, who seem to be way more anxious to help the Ukrainians than this administration.
So you're convinced that his requests are all, syncopado with what you're saying. He's not going to ask for a no-fly zone. He's not going to whipsaw Congress.
He already knows that the U.S. is not going to engage directly in Ukraine. We are not going to enforce a no-fly zone in Ukraine. But there are a lot of weapons that are extremely effective in controlling the air. A good example of that are the MiGs that the Poles were anxious to send to Ukraine, which the administration apparently discouraged them from doing.
Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, the minority leader with other Senate Republicans, news conference on Capitol Hill. Over at the White House, Press Secretary Jen Psaki asked about the potential for more aid and weaponry being sent into Ukraine and the continuing request from the Ukrainian president for a no-fly zone.
President Zelensky is going to be speaking to Congress tomorrow. He's been pushing for fighter jets, a no-fly zone. You have to hear some of those same requests tomorrow as well. Has the administration thinking shifted on that at all? And also, there is rising domestic pressure for the U.S. to do more. How does the president plan to continue being like a voice of restraint in these situations and holding back some of those requests?
Well, first, I don't think the president views himself as a voice of restraint. We have provided and he has approved and expedited the delivery of more assistance, military and security assistance to Ukraine than any year in history. And I did a bit of an outline for you at the beginning, $1.2 billion in assistance, that including $300 million that we've been able to get to Ukrainian fighters, helping them to hold back the Russian military over the past few weeks. It is also true, and there will be more that the president will be able to say over the next few days, given he is about to sign a 13.6, an omnibus bill that includes $13.6 billion in security assistance. So I expect he will share more of those details in the next 24 hours. It is also true that the president has to look at decisions that are made through the prism of what is in our national security interests and global security interests. And he continues to believe that a no-fly zone would be escalatory, could prompt a war with Russia. I don't believe there's a lot of advocates calling for that at this point in time from Capitol Hill, but we certainly understand and recognize that is still a call from President Zelensky.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki also during her briefing today, she announced that President Biden will be traveling to Europe next week.
The president will travel to Brussels, Belgium later this month, where he will join an extraordinary NATO summit on March 24th to discuss ongoing deterrence and defense efforts in response to Russia's unprovoked and unjustified attack on Ukraine, as well as to reaffirm our ironclad commitment to our NATO allies. He will also join a scheduled European Council summit to discuss our shared concerns about Ukraine, including transatlantic efforts to impose economic costs on Russia, provide humanitarian support to those affected by the violence, and address other challenges related to the conflict.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg tweeting, "I've convened an extraordinary summit on the 24th of March at NATO headquarters. We will address Russia's invasion of Ukraine, our strong support for Ukraine, and further strengthening NATO's deterrence and defense. At this critical time, North America and Europe must continue to stand together." Jen Psaki at her briefing also asked about some speculation, some reports that President Biden might make a stop in NATO ally Poland when he's in Europe. It borders Ukraine. Psaki not confirming that. Russia on Sunday fired missiles and hit a large military base in Ukraine close to the Polish border, reportedly killing dozens of people. From CBC News in Canada, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky delivered a powerful personal appeal to Canada to do more to help his embattled country withstand the invasion of Russia. In his speech, which was laced with references to Canadian cities and landmarks, Zelensky asked rhetorically how Canadians would feel if Russia laid siege to Vancouver or targeted the CN Tower in Toronto. Zelensky repeated his call for no-fly zone over his country to prevent the Russian airstrikes that have been killing civilians. That was from CBC reporting. We're going to hear from President Zelensky in just a minute, but first, here is part of the introduction by the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Parliament in the capital city, Ottawa.
You're inspiring democracies and democratic leaders around the world to be more courageous, more united, and to fight harder for what we believe in. You remind us that friends are always stronger together. With allies and partners, we're imposing crippling sanctions to make sure Putin and his enablers in Russia and Belarus are held accountable. Today, in line with our European Union partners, I can announce that we have imposed severe sanctions on 15 new Russian officials, including government and military elites who are complicit in this illegal war. Canada
will continue to support Ukraine with military equipment as well as financial and humanitarian assistance. And we will be there to help rebuild once the aggressor is repelled.
In Canada, we like to root for the underdog. We believe that when a cause is just and right, it will always prevail, no matter the size of the opponent. This doesn't mean it'll be easy. Ukrainians are already paying incalculable human costs. This illegal and unnecessary war is a grave mistake, and Putin must stop it now.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in English and a bit in French with the interpreter, speaking in Parliament in Ottawa, introducing Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who took part virtually as he is still in his country during this war. Zelensky, in his speech, again asking Canada and other NATO military alliance countries to implement a no-fly zone in Ukraine to keep Russian planes from controlling the skies.
I know that you all support Ukraine. We've been friends with you, Justin, but also I would like you to understand and I would like you to feel this, what we feel every day. We want to live, and we want to be victorious. We want to prevail for the sake of life. Can you imagine when you call your friends, your friendly nation, and you ask, please close the sky, close the airspace, please stop the bombing. How many more cruise missiles have to fall on our cities until you make this happen? And they, in return, they express their deep concerns about the situation. When we talk with our partners, and they say, please hold on a little longer. Some people are talking about trying to avoid the escalation. And at the same time, in response to our aspiration to become members of NATO, we also do not hear a clear answer. Sometimes we don't see obvious things. It's a dire straits, but it also allowed us to see who our real friends are over the last 20 days, and as well 8 previous years. I'm sure that you've been able to see clearly what's going on, and I'm addressing all of you. Canada has always been steadfast in their support. You've been a reliable partner to Ukraine and Ukrainians, and I'm sure this will continue.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky through an interpreter, part of his speech today virtually to the Canadian members of Parliament. He'll be addressing the U.S. Congress on Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern. It'll be live on C-SPAN TV. You can watch it anywhere on our free C-SPAN Now mobile video app. Russian journalist who held up an anti-war sign during a state-run news broadcast in Russia appearing in court today. According to a Financial Times reporter in Moscow, the charge against her is a misdemeanor, maximum sentence of 10 days in jail, and she's not being charged under the new Russian so-called fake news law that could have resulted in up to 15 years in prison. In Washington, on the Senate floor, praise for that protester from Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois.
An event occurred yesterday in Moscow, which bears our approval and consideration. On state-run television in Moscow, a woman was reading the propaganda that was on the show when an employee of that same channel burst onto the set and interrupted the news broadcast. Her name, and I'm going to try to pronounce her Russian name here, Marina Ovsyannikova. Marina Ovsyannikova. That's her, standing here holding a sign saying no war. She was wearing a yellow and blue necklace, the colors of Ukraine. And this woman, an actual editor at Channel 1 in Moscow, shouted, "Stop the war, no to war." Their sign says, "Don't believe the propaganda, they're lying to you here." It was signed in English, "Russians against war." Now, this might have been the sort of thing that's just viewed as a disruption, but in Russia, under Putin, her actions constitute a crime. What has happened to her? Well, we don't know. She disappeared shortly after this appearance on television. Under a new law, she could be sentenced to up to 15 years in prison for using the word war to describe Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But she was unbowed. Before her protest, she recorded a video which has been released through a human rights group. I want to read you what she said in this video. "Regrettably, for a number of years, I worked on Channel 1 and worked on Kremlin propaganda. I'm very ashamed of this right now," she said. "Ashamed that I was allowed to tell lies from the television screen. Ashamed that I allowed the zombification of the Russian people. We were silent in 2014 when this was just beginning. We did not go out to protest when the Kremlin poisoned opposition leader Alexei Navalny." She continued, and I quote, "We are just silently watching this anti-human regime, and now the whole world has turned away from us. She told her countrymen and women, and I quote, "Only we have the power to stop all this madness. Go to the protest. Don't be afraid of anything. They can't imprison us all." Mr. President, I believe that if more ordinary Russians knew the truth about what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine, they would join her protest.
The Senate Majority Whip, Dick Durbin, on the Senate floor in Washington. He mentioned Alexei Navalny, a well-known opposition leader in Russia. The Russian government now seeking a 13-year prison sentence against him in Navalny's latest fraud trial. Navalny already serving a 2.5-year sentence for violating parole in a previous fraud case. This time he's accused of embezzling money that he and his foundation raised over the years and also of insulting a judge. Navalny has rejected all the allegations as politically motivated. Also, a Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, telling reporters that that protest by the woman that interrupted the live news bulletin on Russia's state television to announce the war in Ukraine was nothing more than hooliganism. U.S. Senator Jim Risch, Republican from Idaho, during a hearing on effective ways to combat authoritarianism, commenting about the protest.
Probably the most effective pushback I've seen in a long time was on TV last night. Anybody that turned on the news saw the employee of the Russian TV station jump up with a sign and tell the Russian people that what they were hearing was a lie, and that that the whole thing was misrepresented to the Russian people. She was escorted off, and her attorney this morning said she couldn't find her, so I suspect she's probably headed for Siberia or something like that. But I tell you, there were millions and millions of people in Russia that saw that, and I suspect it's a lot of discussion this morning around the country.
Senator Jim Risch during a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing with State Department officials talking about how to counter tactics of authoritarian governments. Later in the day, it was announced that that protester had appeared in court. Almost 15,000 people in Russia have been detained across the country during anti-war protests since February 24th. That's according to an independent protest monitoring group, OVD Info. 2 American journalists so far have been killed covering the war in Ukraine, and they were remembered today in the U.S. House of Representatives by Congressman Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader.
I want to take a moment to acknowledge the devastating news of the 2 confirmed American deaths in Ukraine. Brent Renaud, an American journalist working with a documentary film team, who was fatally shot over the weekend. And Fox News Network just confirmed moments ago one of their cameramen, Pierre Shashevsky, was killed while on assignment in Ukraine. An entire nation grieves with you as you mourn the loss of the loved ones. We also continue to pray for the recovery of Fox News correspondent Benjamin Hall, who suffered serious injuries while covering the war.
Kevin McCarthy of California, the U.S. House Minority Leader, today on the House floor. At the State Department, also mention of the Fox News photojournalist who was killed and the correspondent severely injured in Monday's attack near the Ukrainian capital city, Kyiv. Ned Price is State Department spokesman.
I know all of us in this room were heartbroken yesterday to learn that our colleague, Ben Hall, sustained injuries while reporting from Ukraine. And today I understand that Fox News has announced that his camera operator, Pierre Zakrzewski, lost his life in the same attack. All of us know Ben. We've traveled the world with him. Many of you knew Pierre, who was renowned for his talent documenting conflict zones around the world. Our thoughts are with Pierre's loved ones, his family, and all of us here at the department are rooting for Ben and rooting for his speedy recovery. Ben's collegiality, his sense of humor, his wit, his warmth have always been a balm for the very tough questions that he would always hurl my way at the way of Secretary Blinken. I know I speak for the Secretary when I say that we look forward, once again, hopefully very soon, to being on the receiving end of all of those. We have engaged at multiple levels with Fox News. We have made very clear that we will do everything we possibly can to help Ben and any others who may have been involved and injured in this horrific attack.
State Department spokesman Ned Price started his daily briefing with reporters in the State Department briefing room. And this, finding a bit of humor in some very dark times, after the Russian Foreign Ministry announcing today that U.S. officials are being sanctioned in response to U.S. sanctions against Russian leaders. And the list includes President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, CIA Director William Burns, and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton tweeting in response, "I want to thank the Russian Academy for this Lifetime Achievement Award." Washington Today continues in a minute.
This week on the Lectures in History podcast, a lecture about mid-20th century educational films used to teach students about nuclear warfare and science. Virginia Commonwealth University professor Karen Rader explains.
They've had a lot of success with the use of film for conveying information, for persuading, for convincing. Of course, they would think that it would have more applications in the classroom, but this became even more urgent in the context of the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, and the real escalation of what several people have called the nuclear culture or the nuclear future.
The Lectures in History podcast. Find it and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile video app. It's free, or wherever you get your podcasts. This from thehill.com. President Biden has signed into law a sweeping $1.5 trillion bill that funds the government through September and provides billions in assistance for Ukraine amid the Russian invasion. After months of negotiation, the final text of the funding bill was introduced just last week and moved quickly through the House and Senate, where it passed with bipartisan support. Legislation stretches more than 2,700 pages and funds the government through the current fiscal year. During the signing ceremony today, President Biden highlighting funding for law enforcement programs, opioid response, and reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act included in the bill.
This bill is also going to help face our challenges here at home. It sends a clear message to the American people that we're investing in safety, health, and the future of Americans. Let me just mention a couple of the highlights, starting with community safety. We know what works to make our communities safer, and that's investing in prevention and community police officers so that they can walk the streets, know the neighborhoods, and who can help restore trust and safety in the communities. The answer is not to abandon our streets or to choose between safety and equal justice. It's in this funding bill which we make sure we do both. This budget invests in funding for agencies like the FBI and U.S. Marshals, the Drug Enforcement Agency, but also includes funding for COPS programs to increase community policing and the ability of the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms to tackle gun crime, and it funds entirely new community violence intervention programs just at the Department of Justice. Community violence interruption programs are programs where trusted community members work directly with the people who are most likely to commit or become victims of gun crimes. I had a chance to meet with those leaders in one of the programs in New York City not long ago. I saw the difference they were making every day. We know these programs can dramatically reduce violence, and we're going to fund a lot more of them. This bill also includes grants for state and local law enforcement and crime prevention programs. We're talking about drug treatment programs, school violence prevention programs, programs where people who might end up in prison instead get mandatory mental health care that they need. Part of the safety before any crime is committed. Part of the safety is the ability to feel safe from gender-based violence. I wrote a Violence Against Women Act with many in this room years ago, 28 years ago, to provide protection against domestic violence, stalking, sexual assault, and to support survivors and help them find a way out of those abusive situations they were locked into because they had no means to leave, with support for rape crisis centers as well as housing and legal assistance. The law has saved lives, and that's helped women rebuild their lives and make children a heck of a lot safer. Today, with this bill, we reauthorize and strengthen the Violence Against Women Act. For example, For example, we're doing more to help survivors in rural areas and in underserved communities. Tribal courts will now be able to exercise jurisdiction over non-native perpetrators of sexual assault and sex trafficking. And we're providing more support for legal services and for law enforcement to get the training they need to help handle the trauma survivors are experiencing. I'll have more to say about the Violence Against Women Act tomorrow as well. We're going to be able to fund significant areas in common ground in this bill, especially in areas that I call in my State of the Union address a unity agenda. The things that we can accomplish together, Democrats and Republicans. Two elements of that agenda are, one, beat the opioid epidemic, and two, take on the challenges of mental health, which have been exacerbated because of the COVID problem.
President Biden in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, part of his remarks before signing the $1.5 trillion spending bill that will fund the government through the end of the current fiscal year, which is September 30th. The House passed this so-called omnibus government spending bill last week with two different votes. It was split. The military portion, 361 to 69, and then the non-military part, 260 to 171. Then it was over to the Senate, which had a single vote, 68 to 31. It was bipartisan. One of the Senate no votes, Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, spoke today on the Senate floor.
Last week, the Senate passed a $1.5 trillion funding bill that the Democratic majority insisted was full of must pass, gotta have it, can't live without it provisions that the American people were demanding. Unfortunately, the reality of what made it into that bill doesn't match the fantasy my Democratic colleagues conjured up for the cameras. In reality, this $1.5 trillion package was another spending spree. It was complete with 4,400 earmarks. 4,400 earmarks. Now, these earmarks don't have any federal nexus. They're not connected to your military post, your federal highway. These are things for shopping centers and parks and city renovations and you name it, pet projects. So, Mr. President, that is not government funding. That's a big government windfall that the American people simply can't afford. But as we all know, an inability to pay for these programs has never stopped this Democratic majority from shoving through their radical and increasingly destructive agenda. By their own admission, the out-of-control spending habits have contributed to decades-high inflation. Imagine that.
Senator Marsha Blackburn, Republican from Tennessee, on the Senate floor today, and President Biden did sign that $1.5 trillion government funding bill into law. More from the Hill article about this bill. It does not include billions in COVID-19 funding that the White House had asked Congress for to support the federal government's response to the pandemic. The House stripped the funding out of the bill due to a disagreement involving both parties about offsetting the funding. Senate Republicans insisted the funds be offset with cuts, but a group of House Democrats objected to an agreement that would have rescinded some state aid provided in an earlier relief bill to cover some of the new funding. That was from thehill.com, and so they're at a standstill on moving this extra money forward. Today, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki warning the money is desperately needed.
Today, we've outlined the severe and immediate consequences that the United States will face if Congress fails to provide us with $22.5 billion in emergency funding to fight COVID-19. Those consequences are dire. Fewer monoclonal antibodies sent to states, an inability to purchase additional treatments, fewer tests available to Americans, less surveillance for future variants, and a risk of running short on vaccines. For months, we have been engaging Congress about our needs for additional COVID response funds. Just to give you a few examples, in January, we notified Congress that responding to the unprecedented surge in cases due to Omicron would exhaust our funds. Throughout February, we held briefings about the lack of funding and what the consequences would be if we didn't get additional funds. In the President's State of the Union address, the President called for additional COVID funding, and our National Preparedness Plan made clear that funding is needed. In total, senior administration officials have held more than 36 calls and meetings with Congress and at least 10 briefings to committees to communicate our needs so that we can do what Americans should expect from their government, protecting them from a once-in-a-generation pandemic. I'll finally say on this, with cases rising abroad, scientific and medical experts have been clear that in the next couple of months, there could be increasing cases of COVID-19 here in the United States as well. We talked about this a bit yesterday. Waiting to provide funding until we're in a worse spot with the virus will be too late. We need funding now, so we're prepared for whatever comes.
The White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, and CNN reports that tens of millions of people are living under lockdown in China as the country battles its worst COVID-19 outbreak since the early days of the pandemic. Today is Equal Pay Day. As the Washington Post describes it, it's the day that marks how far into the new year the average woman must work to match what her male counterparts made the year before. And the Post article adds, today that day arrives earlier than it has in its 26-year history. The day marked both at the White House by Democrats in Congress, a news conference led by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and joining that news conference, Congresswoman Jackie Speer of California.
They call this Equal Pay Day, but I like to call it Unequal Pay Day because that's the message that we are conveying today. You've heard the statistics. The numbers are just dismal. And women are making 83 cents on the dollar. African-American women are making 58 cents on the dollar, and Latina women are making 49 cents on the dollar. There was a bot that was created last week that I thought was really interesting. It's called the Gender Pay Gap Bot, and it came out of the UK. And what they found was that for all the lip service we give to equal pay, many other companies are falling woefully below the standards. For instance, in the UK, Goldman Sachs is paying women 36% less than men in those positions. Virgin Atlantic, 58 cents, or 58%, I should say, and Ryanair, 68% less than their male counterparts. We did pass the Paycheck Fairness Act with great, robust energy and support. It is now sitting in the Senate where it has been filibustered. So I really think that more than anything, we have an obligation to right this wrong. And the best way to do it is through the Paycheck Fairness Act. An example, Tracy Rexroth out of the Department of Education in Arizona was hired for the job. Her colleague was hired at the same time. She's making $17,000 less a year because they related it to her prior salary. Prior salary should have anything to do with what you're being paid. So as we look at the rebounding in the economy where men have now regained all of the jobs they lost during the pandemic, there's still 1 million women who are not back at work, and we need to fix that. So I guess the message more than anything is stop with the lip service, stop with the lip gloss during Women's History Month. Let's get to it and get equality on the books.
Congresswoman Jackie Speer, Democrat of California, news conference on Capitol Hill. One of the items she mentions using prior salary. Today, the Office of Personnel Management, that's basically the human resources agency for the federal government, announcing a proposed regulation that would ban the use of prior salary history when hiring and setting compensation for federal workers. Supreme Court nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson meeting with senators one-on-one ahead of next week's confirmation hearing. One of the senators today, Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, although neither saying much with the cameras in the room.
I'm really proud. Yeah, I bet you are.
What do you need to hear to vote for her, Senator Graham? To vote for her again, what do you need to hear?
Okay, 10-second warning.
Thank y'all very much.
Thank you, everybody.
That question, what do you need to vote for her again? Senator Graham, one of 3 Republicans who voted for Judge Jackson when she was confirmed last year to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, but Senator Graham tweeting, "The radical left has won," when President Joe Biden nominated Jackson to the Supreme Court. Another meeting today with Senator Ben Cardin, Democrat from Maryland, who spoke to reporters after.
Looking ahead, do you expect her to get a strong bipartisan vote out of the Senate?
I think that she will be confirmed. I think she deserves the consideration of my Republican colleagues. We'll see how it goes. I expect she'll get a few. I hope she gets many. It's possible. I mean, she's certainly eminently qualified. I recognize it's still early in the confirmation process. We'll see how the hearings go. I think it's hard to make an assessment right now of the vote count until we've gotten further into the confirmation process itself, and that means the hearings.
Senator Ben Cardin with reporters. The Judiciary Committee will begin the hearings for Supreme Court nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson on Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern, with opening statements by the senators and the nominee. We'll have live coverage on the C-SPAN network. Senators' questions start Tuesday, according to the chair of the committee, Dick Durbin. That'll be at 9 a.m. Eastern. You can listen and watch the hearings live in their entirety on C-SPAN television, C-SPAN radio, and the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app. President Joe Biden signed an executive order last week dealing with cryptocurrency. It tells federal agencies to get together and report on how to maximize the potential economic benefits and curb the potential harms of this new technology. Also urges the Federal Reserve to explore whether that central bank should create its own digital currency. Former Acting Assistant Treasury Secretary Gregory Zerzan was on Fox Business today.
I think the industry is trying to put a good face on it because the order literally calls crypto a risk for everything from human rights to climate change to criminal enterprises. The only thing they didn't blame on crypto was COVID-19. The unfortunate thing about the order is instead of saying, look, crypto should be allowed to flourish here in the United States, it takes a top-down, government-run approach that asks every federal department from the EPA to the Department of Justice to Homeland Security to figure out how they can regulate crypto. That's not a pathway to innovation.
More on cryptocurrency and President Biden's executive order. We're joined on the phone by Ari Redbord, who is head of legal and government affairs at TRM Labs, which advises government and private business on blockchain issues. He's also a former Treasury Department senior official. Thank you for being with us. The Biden administration, what was it seeking to do with this executive order, and will it accomplish it?
Well, Michael, first, thanks so much for having me. It was a really interesting executive order on a number of different levels. But what we've seen over the last few years really is the interagencies, sort of federal regulators and executive branch agencies taking disparate action in the cryptocurrency space. We've seen enforcement actions, and we've seen actually sanctions designations. We've seen advisories and guidance. And really, this is the White House using the executive order to sort of play quarterback, to essentially task these agencies to going back and studying cryptocurrency and sort of under their regulations and try to come out at the end of all this with a cohesive or sort of more clear regulatory framework for cryptocurrency. That was certainly the idea. I mean, look, the power of the executive order is really the way for the president, without Congress acting, to order the executive branch agencies to all come together. And that's really what this was about here.
The order warning of some potential downsides of the crypto world, but also some potential upsides. How does the regulation reach the balance between those two?
Yeah, it actually does it really well. In fact, so obviously the taskings that I talked about a moment ago to the federal agencies are really, you need to study illicit finance risks if you're Treasury and the Department of Justice. You need to understand sort of systemic economic risks if you are SEC and CFTC and OCC and sort of the financial regulators. You need to study a central bank digital currency if you're the Federal Reserve. And a lot of those are around sort of what are the risks associated with crypto. But what was really, I thought, extraordinary about this executive order is it also really focused on the power and promise of the technology itself. It actually tasks Treasury with studying sort of what are the financial inclusion aspects of cryptocurrency. It talked about the growing cryptocurrency economy. And really, most profoundly, it talked about the importance of U.S. leadership in the world on crypto and emerging technologies. And that was really, I think it was an extraordinary moment because it really took the conversation from sort of what should we do about this to not only should we regulate in a thoughtful way, but we also, as the U.S., need to be a leader in the space. And that was really the jumping off point for the entire executive order.
One great thing about markets is their reaction tells you a lot. What was the reaction of the cryptocurrency markets to the executive order? Did they like what they saw?
Yeah, no, yeah, it was really interesting. Crypto markets are crazy, and you never know exactly what causes what. But here, look, the crypto industry, I think, was really heartened by this idea of sort of embracing the technology, acknowledging the growing crypto economy, and then also, talking about the importance of America leading in the space. There certainly have been a fair amount of advisories and guidance and regulation in the past that really just focuses on things like the illicit finance risks or the environmental impact. And that's all in here. And that's really important, too. Look, I mean, if the cryptocurrency economy is going to grow and flourish, you have to have things like anti-money laundering. You have to address the issues around illicit finance and the environment. But this was really, I think, refreshing to the crypto industry in that it also had these sort of very positive aspects of cryptocurrency, and you saw the market react to that.
We're talking with Ari Redbord from TRM Labs. A lot of TV ads are popping up now urging the average person to invest in cryptocurrency. Is that a good idea?
Well, so it's interesting. Yeah, there's absolutely, the Super Bowl was riddled with cryptocurrency ads from some of the largest exchanges. And look, there's cryptocurrency is in really its nascent stages. It feels like it's been around for a little while, but really we are pre-first inning in the space. And look, you are still going to see scams and frauds and other sorts of activity, even within the much sort of larger, growing, illicit crypto economy. So obviously you always want to sort of understand those things if you're a consumer. And I think one thing that this executive order does is it really does focus on the importance of consumer protection. And essentially it tasks the Department of Justice and the Consumer Protection Agency with going out and ensuring that consumers are protected as they either decide to invest or sort of even more excitingly start to use crypto as a form of payment.
If the president came to you and said, give me one change, one reform that you would like to see implemented immediately, we don't have to study it for 6 months, what would it be?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Look, I think one thing they're doing, which I really like, is there's this sense that there is a lot of illicit activity within crypto because we read all the time about money laundering and fraud and financial crime. But what you really are, a lot of times are missing, unless it's sort of a big case, like this recent Bitfinex case where there were these arrests in New York City, or the Colonial Pipeline where they recovered the funds, is that you really have extraordinary agents, investigators from the FBI, from Homeland Security, from IRSCI, from Secret Service, really from others that are out there investigating the cases. But I think there's sort of still a handful of teams really across the U.S. government that's focusing on these issues. And I think part of what needs to happen from this executive order is, the Department of Justice and Treasury are going to come back and say, hey, these are the laws that we need in order to have more agents, to have more investigators, to have sort of more visibility on illicit finance and crypto. And I think that sort of really sort of working with Congress to provide the training and the resources that law enforcement needs right now will go a long way towards, building that trust layer, or, as we say at TRM, helping to build a safer financial system for billions of people.
Ari Redbord is head of legal and government affairs at TRM Labs. Their website is trmlabs.com, and follow them on Twitter at @aredbord. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Wall Street today, the Dow up 599, NASDAQ up 367, S&P up 89. Sarah Bloom Raskin has withdrawn her nomination for a seat on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors after Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, announced his opposition on Monday. And his vote combined with the unanimous Senate Republican opposition in a 50-50 Senate, indicating that she was not likely to be confirmed. Senate confirming Shalonda Young as director of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, also known as the White House Budget Office. First black woman in history to hold that position. A vote in the Senate 61-36, and it comes almost a year after she was named acting director. And the Senate unanimously passing a bill to make daylight saving time permanent. If the legislation is passed by the Senate, signed by President, the public would no longer be changing its clocks twice a year, as most of the country did just last weekend. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Get more top Washington stories sent right to you each day with C-SPAN's evening newsletter, Word for Word. You can subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Hope you have a good night.